So next, I would like to introduce an old friend of mine, Carrie Holstead, who I've known for a long time. Carrie is the founder and president of Carrie Holstead Real Estate Consultants, and she's really been a pioneer in the corporate real estate industry and a recognized leader in tenant representation. So she began at the Pittsburgh-based SOFR organization and then at Cushman and Wakefield. And she decided to build her own world-class firm dedicated exclusively to representing tenants and users of corporate space, with clients ranging from entrepreneurial entities to Fortune 500 companies. And she's represented people in Pittsburgh and around the world. So Carrie sends a newsletter out, which I get and I enjoy reading all the time. And when I looked at the newsletter, I thought that it would be really useful to have her come and talk about the changes in the accounting rules in the U.S. and internationally, because they're going to come in 2019, but our clients are right now preparing for that change. So I think it's a timely topic, and I'm going to turn this over to Carrie. Please join me in welcoming her.
Carrie?
Thank you. Thank you, Dusty. Thank you very much. You're ahead of the curve. I will tell you, you are just ahead of the curve in jumping on this. And when I was contacted to say, let's talk about this, I was delighted to put together some information for you. And it wasn't only me. I am part of a global organization. So we actually put a study together in preparation for this presentation today. And you'll be seeing that. Let's see if I know how to do this. Oh, good. So what I'm going to talk about today are a few things. Jack had asked me to put together some information that addresses a few topics, and those topics are going to be how the accounting rules are changing, who will be impacted, are companies prepared, and our study will address that, when do companies need to be prepared, and we heard that reference, Dusty referenced that, and what are 8 ways you can help your clients. So let me share that information with you. First of all, the big picture is that corporate real estate leases are going on the balance sheet for the first time. Whether somebody is following the Financial Accounting Standards Board standards, which is FASB, or whether they are following the international standards, International Accounting Standards Board, IASB, they are going to result for the first time ever in corporate real estate leases going on the balance sheet. This is being done to create transparency, so anybody who is a stakeholder in the company can really understand the indebtedness of the company. So who will be impacted? Very simply, anybody following the GAAP rules or the IFRS rules is going to have to follow these new standards. And when I say the GAAP standards, I am referring to the FASB standards in the U.S. Internationally, I'm following the IFRS rules, or IASB rules. Anything that begins with an I is an international standard. So anybody who is currently following those rules is going to be impacted. And as long as they are entering into leases that are longer than 12 months, this is going to apply. Are your clients prepared? This is the million-dollar question. And we really wanted to understand this very well in preparing me to come in and chat with all of you folks about this. So we went to all of our global offices, ITRA Global offices, and we did a study. We went out to organizations, companies around the world, very large and medium size, and we asked the question, are you ready for this? Do you know what it's about, and what do you think the impact is going to be on your organization? So I want to share with you a representative sampling of what the responses were. It was a surprise to us, and I think it will be a surprise to you as well. Here's what we saw. One company came back, and this is the finance manager of a media group. This came from our Paris office. I think it's a couple of years away, he said, so we haven't really looked at it. That was one person. Or we'll start entering into leases, shorter-term leases, 2-year leases. The third quarter of this year is what we heard from the facilities director of an engineering firm. We also heard that from the CFO of a water, energy, and waste management company. We heard from one company, the director of real estate for an aerospace and defense company, and what they said is, well, from the real estate perspective, we're not really involved in this, except the CFO has asked us for a list of lease obligations. So we're hearing that from one company. One CEO, and this is a client of mine, said, "You're the first to bring this accounting rule change to my attention. Thank you very much." So those are the types of answers that we're getting. We did hear from a retail company saying, we have done a fair amount of work on this, on the new rules, but less thinking on the implications of our approach. So generally speaking, across the board, we did not see that companies were very well prepared for this. So the question becomes, is it important that they get prepared or are prepared right now? And the reason it is important that they get prepared very, very quickly is because there's something called a look-back reporting period. Now, the look-back reporting period goes into effect 2 years prior to the new rules going into effect. So, for public companies, the new rules go into effect in 2019, which means the look-back period starts in 2017. That's clearly right around the corner. For private companies, there's a little bit more leeway. It is the case that those rules go into effect in 2020, so the look-back period starts in 2018. So here we are almost in the third quarter of 2016, and for public companies, that is going to go into effect, this look-back period, at the beginning of next year. So it's very important that the public companies really get on top of this issue. Now, what are the 8 ways you can help your clients? We gave a lot of consideration to what the folks told us in our survey. And we took that information in trying to develop 8 ways that we think you can be most helpful to your clients. And this is what we came up with. Number 1, develop the best corporate real estate strategy now. We have found in our discussions that companies that are coming up with the best corporate real estate strategies are those that have the input of the CEO, the CFO, the corporate real estate executive, human resource, and information technology executives. You saw some of the responses. There is what we would term a disjointed effort in some cases where there is not a lot of input from the entire team, or the CFO is working on this and the CEO has no idea this is going on, or the CFO is working on it and it's the case that the corporate real estate department has not had much, if any, input into the strategy. Our recommendation, get everybody who has is going to be vastly impacted in this around the table and give them input into the strategy. Number 2, the strategy has to provide flexibility to respond to market conditions. We shared in our slide here, hopefully you can all see it, the vacancy rates from some markets that we know you have offices in. We pulled out 4 key markets: New York City, Paris, Pittsburgh, London. All of your markets are clearly important, but we only had a small area, so we selected 4 to show you what's going on in those markets. The most important thing, if you look to the far right of the graph, is that in 2016, if you look at that part of the graph, you see that all of these markets have vacancy rates that are at or below 8%. Well, that means we're getting into some pretty tight markets. So New York City is at 8%. Pittsburgh right now is at 7.7%. Paris is just below that, and London is significantly below that. Pittsburgh, you can see, has bucked the trend. While a lot of markets went into a period in 2008 and 2009 during the recession, their vacancy rates went up. Not in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh for the last 10 years has had vacancy rates go down. Nonetheless, if we look at where we are today, it is the case that there are a lot of tighter markets out there, and the leasing strategy has to allow for flexibility as these markets are tightening and leasing options are diminishing. Along those same lines, as these strategies are being put together. You saw in our study that a couple of companies have said we're going to go with short-term strategies. And what you'll see if you do a lot of reading or research or talking to people about this, and we've seen this very much as an immediate reaction to talking about the accounting rules and understanding that now the leases are going to go on the balance sheet, and the immediate reaction of people is to say, let's do short-term leases. That's going to lessen the amount of the impact on our balance sheet. And that's going to be a good impact, or the right strategy, I should say, for some companies. But what we encourage companies to do is also take a look at the benefits and the drawbacks of the corporate real estate strategy. When you're looking at a shorter-term lease, for example, you have to consider the construction costs. If you go from a 10-year term to a 3-year term and you have $100,000 in tenant improvement costs that you're going to amortize, by shortening that amortization period, you're increasing threefold the cost per year of those construction costs. That has to be weighed. The rising rental rates. I'll take Pittsburgh as an example. We saw that over the last 10 years in Pittsburgh, the rental rates have come down the vacancy rates have come down every year. Well, as the vacancy rates have come down, the opposite has occurred with rental rates, and they've gone up every year. So anybody who signed a 10-year lease in 2006 and has a lease expiring now, they're looking at the rental rate that they had locked in 10 years ago, and they're saying, oh my gosh, I can't touch that today. Thank goodness I tied that in for a 10-year period. And I was wise in doing so, because if I had done short-term leases, as the rental rates go up, they would have renegotiated their lease and they would have increased the amount they were paying. And by the end of that, if they had done short-term leases, they would have paid far more over the same 10-year period. So rising rental rates has to be taken into consideration. And then there's the issue of risk management. And I just ran into this. Fortunately, I was on the positive end of it with a client of mine where corporate headquarters is consolidating 2 operations. And we went to the landlord of the current building and said, this is what we need to do. We need to expand the space. We're looking at the current building. We're looking at alternative buildings. We're looking at a long-term lease. And we know that there are tenants on the adjacent floors. And the landlord responded by saying, I have a tenant on the adjacent floor who's doing short-term leases. I would much prefer to have a long-term lease rather than these short-term leases, which opens up the possibility of them leaving at any point. So you get into a risk management issue when you talk about these short-term leases, and you do open the door to the possibility of being forced out of your space by somebody else coming along and saying, I will agree to do a longer-term lease. So again, when you look at a strategy and you look at short-term leases, make sure that these, what I would consider drawbacks, are just something to be taken into consideration. Make sure everybody's on the same page and understands that these things can happen. One of the other things we talk about when we talk about risk management is the cost and disruption to move an operation. So that has to be factored into it. So are these short-term leases really a good solution? In some cases they may be, but you want to understand the drawbacks as well. Here's something that by knowing this, it's going to put you in a very small category of people that recognize this big, big surprise that most people just don't know about. I see Dusty nodding her head. She probably knows about it, but I doubt that many people know about this issue. So there are 2 issues that are happening. With this new standard, it is the case that leases are going on the balance sheet. But in addition to that, if a company is following the IASB accounting rule standards, the other thing that is happening is they have one option when these rules go into effect. And that option is that what is now, and most leases are classified as operating leases, in the future they are going to be classified as finance leases. This reclassification in and of itself is going to have a huge impact on companies with a large portfolio. And just to put that into perspective, I'm aware of 2 companies right now that just the reclassification of these leases from operating to finance leases is going to have a $100 million impact on their revenue. Let me say that again. $100 million impact on the revenue, just the reclassification of the leases. So these large organizations are recognizing that they are going to have to put these leases on the balance sheet, but a lot of them are not recognizing this issue. It is going to be a huge, huge issue, and by bringing that to the attention of your clients who are following the IASB accounting rules, it will be very beneficial. And as you can imagine, as we put all this additional debt on the balance sheet and the indebtedness of these companies goes up, some of these companies, to be sure, are going to exceed their debt-to-equity ratios required by their bank loan agreements. Now, you don't want to leave this until the last minute. If you have to renegotiate a bank loan agreement, you need to get around the table and understand when this is going to happen and make sure that those bank loan agreements are understood, and if there's going to be an impact, you need to put a strategy together that is going to resolve that issue, because this will be happening with some companies as the indebtedness goes up. Know what to do with a renewal option. This is some place that we find that there is a tremendous amount of confusion out there. And we find that if you ask 9 people out of 10, what do you know, if anything, about a renewal option under the new standards, some of them know that a renewal option, if it's reasonably certain that the company is going to exercise the renewal option, it has to go on the balance sheet. So the question becomes, if it's going to have to go on the balance sheet, if, for example, you have a 5-year lease and a 5-year renewal option, does it just make sense to do a 10-year lease transaction if it's going on the balance sheet anyhow? And what most people are saying is a very gray area when you talk about reasonably certain. And by the way, that has to be determined day one of the lease. That's not something that you can leave open-ended. But a lot of people think this is a gray area. Here's why it's a lot less gray than most people think it is. If you look at the bottom of that slide, it talks about the incentives. This is what's going to determine it's reasonably certain if somebody is going to renew their lease. If there are incentives to do so. One example would be if there's a discount. For example, if somebody has in their a renewal option at 90% of the fair market value, that's a 10% discount. So that's an incentive to renew the lease. If there is a penalty, and by penalties, an example would be restorations or dilapidations. We see a lot of this in the international markets where the space has to be restored at the end of the lease. Well, that's a penalty also that would drive a company to be reasonably certain that they're going to renew the lease. And that can be very costly. And I just put this out there with regard to dilapidations. Everybody should understand that those are negotiable. We're just finishing up negotiations on behalf of a client in London. We've done 2 recent transactions for them in terms of dilapidations, and we're negotiating the dilapidation cost. My client, who is a financial services company, had gotten a bill in for dilapidations. We had our team look at that bill, and our team assessed it very carefully. We got into negotiations, and on 2 transactions that were not particularly large, we reduced the cost of dilapidations by $2 million. So understand that that is subject to negotiation, and just because a landlord sends a bill and says, this is what's going to cost to restore the space, that doesn't mean that's the final cost. Getting back to the incentives, tenant improvements and alterations. If the useful life of the tenant improvements that the tenant has paid for are longer than the term of the lease, again, that's an incentive to renew. And finally, another incentive may be the strategic value. And by that, the first thing that comes to mind is the proximity of the space. For example, doctors. Doctors will locate near in an office building near where they have privileges. And there's value in being in close proximity to the hospital where they have privileges. And so because of that strategic value, again, that is an incentive. Those are the types of things that are being looked at to determine if it's reasonably certain if somebody is going to exercise a renewal option. So understand, when we look at these renewal options and people say this is a very gray area, it's a lot less gray than you would think when you factor in the incentives to renew. Know what to do with a sublease. It is the case that if you have clients who are the sublessor of space, financially, it's in their best interest to conclude a transaction prior to these new accounting rules going into effect. Prior to them going into effect. So any of your clients who are considering subleasing space, bring this to their attention because you want to start on that now. Most of these spaces take a little while to sublease, so you want to get that started now. From the subleasee standpoint, not going to be much of a difference at all. There isn't an incentive to get that done prior to the change. And I always like finishing a presentation with a pile of money. So we have a pile of money there, and that is intended to send the message, and this is huge. If any of your clients are remotely considering a sale-leaseback, or even if they're not considering a sale-leaseback and they own a building, do bring to their attention that it is very much in their best interest financially to conclude a sale-leaseback prior to the point at which these new rules take effect. They're changing completely. How the sale is booked under the new rules will change, and it's not as attractive once they go into effect. So you do want to make sure, if anybody's doing a sale-leaseback, that it is done prior to the time these new rules go into effect. So now you know how the accounting rules are changing, who will be impacted, that most companies are really not prepared, when companies need to be prepared, and again, this look-back period, which kicks in either 2017 for companies following, the public companies, and for private companies in 2018, and then 8 ways you can help your clients. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I've included my contact information up there. If anybody has any questions, they are welcome to call or email me, and I'm happy to address any questions that anybody has. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Carrie for this really informative presentation. Next up is Nick in DC.
All right.